Good morning. I hope you and your families are well on this peculiar Easter morning. We are gathering around this collection of videos to share faith and to imagine that those we know from UUFDC are with us in spirit. In years from now, we will be telling the story of how we survived the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020. And the stories that come out of this event will be absorbed into our culture, of our community, of our nation, and of our world. And by the way, don't we need a sexier name for this pandemic? COVID-19 sounds like a secret military organization. What will be remembered are the stories of heroes, nurses and doctors, medical researchers, pharmacists and grocers, friends and neighbors. We'll retell over and over how our neighbors gathered in the evening on their front porches, how choirs produced miraculous concerts with each member singing from their own home. We will also remember our losses, and each family will recount how that loss came about. And even though the politics of this year will be recorded in history, they will not be absorbed into the culture of the people, because the stories that define our culture are those that we use to pass understanding and wisdom through the generations. They are stories that define us as a people and help us get through the dark times such as these. Already we are talking about what it will be like when the pandemic subsides. This overwhelming optimism in the American character comes from a history of successfully overcoming adversity at personal, community, and national levels. In no small part, the American story is informed by the stories of Jews and Christians as told in the Bible. I'm sure many of you can point to the person in your family who has the most worn out, marked up, dog-eared Bible. And if your family doesn't reference the Bible specifically, I invite you to explore the many common sayings that we use daily that are forgotten, that we have forgotten have biblical origins. Phrases like a wolf in sheep's clothing and the blind leading the blind, eat, drink, and be merry, by the skin of your teeth. The Hebrew Bible is the story of a people, some history, some fable, all with meaning. The great waves of the story tell of a people rising out of slavery with Moses, and then the northern kingdom falls into the exile of the Assyrians, and then they rise again only to have the southern kingdom fall to the Babylonians and Solomon's temple destroyed. Upon returning, the nation rebuilds the temple until the Roman occupation, which ends in the destruction of the second temple and the creation of the Jewish diaspora. A Jewish scholar once told me that the uniqueness of the Jewish civilization is that it was not crushed by the destruction of their temples, because they had their stories to bind them together. These are great stories of destruction and resurrection. And today, Christians around the world celebrate the greatest story of this era, the story of the death of Jesus and the resurrection of the Christ. You can read the story in each of the Gospels. Mark writes the briefest account, making no mention of a resurrection, only an empty tomb. Matthew reports 2 appearances, one in Jerusalem and one in Galilee. Luke offers 2 more extensive stories, both occurring in Jerusalem. And he expands the story of Pentecost with the book of Acts. And John writes of 4 appearances in both Jerusalem and Galilee. John ends with Jesus inviting Peter to follow the path he has walked. And these are the stories that we celebrate today. They were written in order to preserve the oral stories that were spreading through the Eastern Mediterranean. Mark was the first, written about 70 CE, and John was the last, written soon into the 2nd century. There were also Gospels written by the Apostle Thomas and by Mary Magdalene. These, however, failed to make the cut into the official church canon. Those that made the cut came to define Western civilization. The christening of the West began with with the Emperor Constantine. In 325 CE, the First Council of Nicaea met and began the process of defining Christianity into its common form, the Holy Trinity and the biblical canon. Later, other doctrine was added by St. Augustine, who gave us the idea of original sin. In fact, it is that doctrine which gave rise to the theory that Jesus died on the cross in order to forgive our sins. As Adam and Eve fell from grace and brought humanity with them, so Jesus rose into grace and redeemed the sin of humanity. All of these additional pieces inform our culture today, and it all began with the crucifixion of an itinerant preacher from Galilee. Over the centuries, there have been many debates about the truth of these events. How could a dead man come back to life? Was Jesus really dead when they put him in the tomb? Or were the disciples having a common hallucination? Is the Christ a spiritual being capable of earthly manifestation? The facts of the event are well beyond knowing with any certainty today. But the truth of the story is still worth exploring. Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan wrote a beautiful modern interpretation of Holy Week in their book, The Last Week. In it, they talk about parables as means of expressing truth. And they write, the obvious insight is that parables can be truthful and truth-filled independently of their factuality. Because of the importance of this insight, we state it again in only slightly different language. The truth of a parable, of a parabolic narrative, is not dependent upon its factuality. Seeing the Easter stories as parable does not involve a denial of their factuality. It's quite happy leaving the question open. What it does say is that the importance of these stories lie in their meaning. Unquote. So what truth can we as Unitarian Universalists discern from this story that has thrived for 2 millennia? It is worth noting that many of us come from other traditions where Easter was a major event of the year. Along with Christmas, Easter would certainly bring the biggest crowds to church. And memories of those springtime trips to church with the whole family may still linger for some of us. We should also note that both Unitarians and Universalist traditions were decidedly Christian, and the resurrection of the Christ was a critical piece of the theology. We don't generally ascribe to a concept of original sin, and therefore we don't generally carry the concept of Christ's redemption of that sin. What we have shared in common throughout our parallel histories is the idea that there is but one God, and that Jesus was human. In 1841, the Unitarian Reverend Theodore Parker delivered a sermon in Boston entitled "The Permanent and the Transient in Christianity." His notion that Jesus was a man was controversial in Orthodox circles. If the things Jesus did were the act of a God, then he would serve no purpose to humanity. How can we follow one who has powers beyond those we possess ourselves? Parker wrote, "Make him a God, the Son of God in a peculiar and exclusive sense. Much of the significance of his character are gone. His virtue has no merit, his love no feeling, his cross no burden, his agony no pain. His death is an illusion, his resurrection a show. For if he were not a man, but a God, what are all these things? What his words, his life, his excellence of achievement? It is all nothing, weighted against the illimitable greatness of him who created whole worlds and fills up all time and space. Then his resignation is no lesson, no life, and his life no model. His death no triumph to you or me. who are not gods but mortal men, that know not what a day shall bring forth. And although Parker is making a solid argument for the humanity of Jesus, he still refers to his death and resurrection. It was an important factor in lifting up Jesus as a model for humanity. The story of the resurrection of the Christ mirrors the stories of the Jewish nation as told in the Hebrew Bible. Jesus experienced the greatest fall a man can experience, a torturous death. Some say he even descended into hell. Then he rose up even greater than before. The Jews experienced destruction and rebirth as a nation and took guidance from their history that no matter the travesty, their faith in God will see them through. Jesus made this story personal. He shows each of us that no matter what has devastated our dreams, no matter how great the pain, we can persist and grow through it. Today we can make the obvious relationship of our current crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic. People are dying, the economy is almost non-extant, and there is an expectation of greater suffering. Yet our national character has us continue to find ways to survive, ways to overcome the disease, ways to find spirit in our isolation. The stories of nightly applause in New York City for the healthcare workers inspires us. The stories of neighbors visiting on their front porches, millions of face masks being sewn in short order, singing together from balconies, helping the weak and the suffering. These are all indications of our national character that stem from an inherent belief that we will come through this and we will thrive again. It is the underlying story of our culture. There are, of course, those who will use the Christ story to exploit the fears we're having, those who promote prayer as an alternative to social distancing. After all, when we sit close together and speak in unison, is not that a better way to prevent the spread of an airborne disease than keeping our distance? Some will seek out the weakest and most fearful among us and exploit them for cash. One televangelist blew into his hands and said he was blowing the virus away with the breath of God. The Unitarian minister, Reverend William Ellery Channing, would respond that God gave us minds and God expects us to use them. So like all cultures, ours has a downside, but cultures survive along their upsides. And this story of thriving in the face of adversity, indeed using adversity to transform our way of living, exists in many other cultures. The story of Blue Elk that Paula read for us this morning is just one example. It is a retelling of a Pueblo story that lifts up some of the values of that culture. The holiness of all living beings and the spirit that permeates all of creation. The elk and the boy enjoy a deep friendship, exposing the deep relationship between the people and nature. The elk gives the hunter its breath, the breath being a common metaphor for the spirit. The antlers of the elk merge into the growing cedar, an indication that all life returns and renews. The elk gives Blue Elk the gift of the flute, an instrument that depends upon breath to make music. With this one story, we can learn so much about another culture. The Easter story is a story that has defined Western civilization, girded the American culture, and reverberated throughout our arts and literature. It was proselytized by the Apostle Paul, institutionalized by the Emperor Constantine. It saw us through the dark ages after the fall of Rome, and carried us over the sea to unknown lands. It gave rise to a capitalist economic system, story for another time, and justified our use of violence to conquer and pillage. One conquered native mocked that we had to nail our God to a tree in order to keep an eye on him. In all dimensions, this story of death and resurrection has launched our civilization through the ages. Today, a different understanding of the story needs to be written. Beyond the scourge of coronavirus, we need a story that will help us overcome the division of our people and the destruction of our planet. We need a story that will include all people, not just those few who have chosen to repeat the words that they have been taught. We need a story that helps us see beyond boundaries, even the boundary of death. We need a story that will align us with the universal and the infinite, one that connects us in space with all that is, one that reaches all the way back in time and all the way out into the future. A story of one who died and is still living. I hope you have a peaceful and productive week coming up. I pray that you will all be safe. Amen.